Today we're going to be learning Pesachim Daf Nun Chet. We're starting Tamid Nishchat, the new perek, which we already gave an introduction yesterday. If you didn't hear the introduction, then worthwhile to go back to the last probably 10 minutes of yesterday's class to hear the introduction to Korbanot, which is going to basically take us through the next number of chapters till we get to the 10th chapter. Speaking of the 10th chapter, today's the second class of the skills class. So anyone who hasn't yet joined is welcome to join. You can make up today's class. Again, to join, you have to register, and then within the system, you'll find all the links you need, everything else. So even if you want to join for independent study, you can do the course on your own at any time that you want. It's always going to be available on our website, or you can do it live. It'll be tonight, Israel time. So if you're listening, it won't be night necessarily for all of you, but it'll be at 8:30 Israel time Monday evenings for the next 9 more weeks. Okay. We're going to start now. Today's daf and this week's daf learning actually is in honor of Rachel Bat Chana, wishing her a refuah shlema and mihira, quick recovery. We're going to start at the top of the daf, which is always nice. Tamid nishchat b'shmona v'mechza. You would have expected, we're going to start talking about the Pesach sacrifice, that the first thing they would talk about is, when do we do the Pesach sacrifice? But that's not what they do. What they do is they talk about when we do the Korban Tamid, which, as we said yesterday, already the Gemara started mentioning this Korban Tamid, the daily sacrifice that we bring. And that was what, remember that Kohen Gadol had responded to the king, oh, well, if the Gedi was so worthwhile, we would have used him for the Korban Tamid. Again, highlighting what we talked about yesterday is that it's really the Korban Tamid. You think, oh, the Korban Pesach was this one special event. And this is kind of putting things in perspective. It's telling you, yes, we're talking about the Korban Pesach, but it's the constants in our lives that are the things that really are the most important, right? I was thinking about the obvious comparison to Daf Yomi, right? You could go to a once a year shiur and it's amazing and you hear it, right? But it's that everyday learning, that it's not always exciting every day and it's not always easy every day, but it's that every day that you do it, that really gives you the strength. It's the power. That connects you to God. It's doing something every day and not just once in a while. You have a big celebration that's very exciting and you feel very connected, but the idea is to stay connected every single day. So interestingly, the chapter starts off specifically with the Korban Tamid, and what we have today is what I would call a logistics day. We're talking basically all about how the logistics worked. In fact, somebody wrote me yesterday, Elisa had written me about all these questions about the logistics of how the Korban Pesach worked, and it's very complicated, the logistics. And here we're going to start to see how they manage the logistics of the scheduling, right? I think about my son in the army, and he's in course Ksinim, and he's always like, it's all about the lose, you have to organize the day. And if the day's not organized well, then it just doesn't work out well. So it's all about, you have to be very organized and things have to have a particular schedule. And we're going to see all sorts of scheduling considerations in today's daf. So with that, let's start. Tamid nishchat b'shmona v'mechza. So the Korban Tamid is slaughtered at 8.5 hours into the day. V'karev b'tish'a v'mechza. And it sacrificed at 9. Okay, so it's slaughtered at 8.5, sacrificed at 9.5. Rashi says doesn't exactly mean what you think it means. What it means is you start dealing with at 8:30 and at 8.5 hours, which is 2:30 in the afternoon. Again, going back to what we've talked about, the day was divided into 12 equal parts. So 8.5 hours, let's say the day starts at 6 and ends at 6, and you have 12 equal hours. So 8.5 hours into the day will be 2:30 in the afternoon. So at 2:30 in the afternoon, they would start to do the Korban Tamid on a regular day. Just so that you don't get confused, the whole topic today is the Korban Tamid. We're not talking at all, ever, about what time we do the Pesach sacrifice. Okay, it obviously is going to be sometime after the Korban Tamid, probably when they finish. But that's not what they're discussing. What they're discussing is, when do we do that daily sacrifice? Also, to go back and give you some more background, this daily sacrifice was brought once in the morning and once in the evening, or bein ha'arbaim, afternoon. So what is afternoon, right? That's going to be part of this discussion. So that's why they say 2.5 hours into the day, and it's finished by 3.5 hours, which, by the way, we always say the korbanot, our prayers are in place of the sacrifices, right? There's a whole big debate we saw in Masechet Brachot about, is it Keneged Avot, or is it because of the fathers, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, or the sacrifices? In the end, everyone agrees it's also connected to the sacrifices. This would explain Mincha Ktana, because the finishing, right? They would finish the Korban Tamid, which basically our Mincha service is the same idea, this idea, by the way, of the constants, right? The davening 3 times a day. That's also connected to these constants. And the mincha prayer is because of the korban tamid of ben ha'arbayim. This would explain mincha ktana of 3:30 in the afternoon as being the second mincha time period, would be understood here about this 9.5. In any case, Arvei Pesachim, I'll just tell you also very worthwhile to use the sheet today. Okay, it's one of those days that it's critical in understanding the daf. There's also an excellent chart in the Koren. If you have that, you can use that also. It'll very much help you. So now it says, so the tamid on a regular day is sacrificed 8.5 hours into the day, and it's finished up by 9.5 hours. We're going to see today throughout that the assumption is a typical sacrifice takes an hour of dealing with. But Arvei Pesachim nishchat b'sheva v'mechza. But on Erev Pesach, again, we're not talking about the Korban Pesach. On Erev Pesach, when they did the Pesach sacrifice, they would do the Korban Tamid, the daily offering, an hour earlier. Now you see why they're not interested in the morning one, because we're only talking Pesach was done in the afternoon, and the Korban Tamid of the afternoon was done in the afternoon, and we have to balance, right? How do we deal with the timing? So basically, they would do it all an hour earlier, so it would start an hour earlier, finish an hour earlier. Bein bechol, bein b'Shabbat. According to our Mishnah, and I say specifically according to our Mishnah, because we're going to see a different opinion later, it doesn't matter whether Erev Pesach falls on a regular day. It doesn't matter if it falls on a Shabbat. It's all the same. The timing is the same. Now, why would Shabbat be any different? So we're going to learn that on Shabbat, one of the differences between Shabbat and a regular day is that on a regular day, you could bring all sorts of other voluntary offerings. So voluntary offerings could be brought all day long. Well, not exactly. We're going to learn soon. The last sacrifice of the day has to be the Korban Tamid, okay, other than the Pesach, which we're going to have to deal with tomorrow. But assuming we're not talking about the Pesach right now, the Korban Tamid has to be last. If the Korban Tamid has to be last, and potentially people could bring all sorts of voluntary offerings, so even though you theoretically maybe could do it earlier, we push it off to allow time for all these other voluntary offerings. But on Shabbat, you don't have any of these voluntary offerings, because on Shabbat, you can't bring voluntary offerings on Shabbat. Shabbat, the only sacrifices we allow are the ones you have to bring, because it involves chilul Shabbat, right? You have to slaughter animals, you have to burn them on, right? You have to do all sorts of things that we don't normally do on Shabbat. So we allow it for obligatory, but not for voluntary. So in any case, let's read on. So bein b'chol, bein b'Shabbat, it doesn't matter. It's still the same, even though theoretically maybe one could think to make differences and just differentiations, and we'll talk about all the possibilities later. Chal Erev Pesach liop Erev Shabbat. What if Erev Pesach comes out on Friday? Now here we have a big difference. What's the difference? Normally you slaughter the animal and then you'd start roasting the meat. You could roast the meat, you can still start during the day, roast it through the night, doesn't matter. But on Erev Pesach, everything has to be finished before nighttime. You can't be roasting at night because it's Shabbat. So because of that, right, classic, Erev Shabbat, you got to start everything earlier. So on Erev Shabbat, nishchat b'shesh b'mechze, b'karev b'sheva b'mechze, b'pesach acharav. And then you would do the Pesach right after that. Okay, so on Friday afternoon, everything had to be pushed earlier, which makes a lot of sense. So again, let's just review. Our Mishnah is very simple. It's only going to get complicated later. Our Mishnah says, let's start with the earliest time. Earliest time you do it is 6.5 hours. You do that on a Friday when you have to get everything in earlier. Again, the everyday, daily afternoon sacrifice. When it comes to Erev Pesach, doesn't matter what day of the week it comes out on, right? As long as it's not a Friday. If it's a Friday, then it's 6.5 hours. If it's, now, by the way, on a regular Friday, the Korban Tamid was done the regular time because you didn't have to worry about roasting meat or anything for Pesach, right? It's only because of the Korban Pesach. We assume if you start at 2.5 hours at 2:30 in the afternoon, you finish at 3:30, that's still enough time to deal with that sacrifice before Shabbat. It's only when you have to add an additional of the Pesach that we have to make it earlier. And then you have so then every Erev Pesach, we do everything an hour earlier, unless it's Friday. And then you have the regular day where we do it at 8.5 hours into the day, 2:30 in the afternoon. So we have 6.5 hours, 7.5, and 8.5. Minani mile. So first the Gemara is just going to ask, where do we get this that the Korban Tamid is at 8.5 hours? We're going to have two answers and one is going to be rejected. Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Damaka. The pasuk says, "Et hakeves echad taaseh baboker ve'et hakeves hasheni taaseh ben ha'arbayim." This is the verse that talks about the daily sacrifice. You do one in the morning and you bring the second lamb in the afternoon. Uses the term ben ha'arbayim. Let's explain what ben ha'arbayim is. So what does he say? Between the Aravim, okay, which we're going to see exactly what they mean. They say, we want to put it smack in the center of the afternoon. Okay, ben ha'arbayim means between the two afternoons, so to speak, or however you would define it. So how do we do that? Well, there's 6 hours. So if you want it smack in the middle, and it takes an hour to deal with, so subtract that 1 hour, you end up with really 5 hours. So 2.5 this way, 2.5 that way. And that gets you exactly to 2:30 in the afternoon, right? That's 2.5 hours after midday. So, 2.5 hours that way, 2.5 hours that way, So according to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, since the verse says ben arbayim, it means exactly smack in the center of the afternoon. To which Rava questions and says, that doesn't make any sense that you could say this. Mativ Rava. But we just said that on Erev Pesach, they would do the daily sacrifice an hour earlier. And it was finished 2.5 hours into the day. Bein b'chol, bein b'Shabbat, whether it comes out on a daily, doesn't matter what day of the week. Right, here comes this question. If you say that by Torah law, it states bein ha'arbayim means between 8.5 and 9.5 hours, then there would be no way to do this any earlier on just because it's Erev Pesach. If the Torah law designates specifically that hour, then you wouldn't be able to change it just because you need to get your Pesach in. So therefore, Rava has a different answer. El Hama Rava, mitzvatot tamid mishiyinatut lalei erev. He says, the mitzvah of the Korban Tamid is when the sun starts to go in the other direction, right? The sun starts to go, right? The sun is midday in the middle, and then it starts to shift toward where it's heading in the evening. So the mitzvah is as soon as you're in afternoon. That's when the time for the mitzvah is. My time, Damarka ben ha'arbayim. What is ben ha'arbayim according to him? Mi'idna dematchil shim shel ma'arev, from lashon ma'arav, west, when the sun starts to go to the west. Hilkach b'shar yemot hashana di'ika nidarim u'nidavot. Therefore, so theoretically, you can start already from 6.5 hours into the day. But what's the issue? As I mentioned before, all other days of the week, you have nidarim and nidavot. People can bring voluntary offerings. Derachmana amal, and the Torah says. Now you might say, okay, so bring them after the Korban Tamid, but you can't do that. Why? Aleha chalbei hashlamim, amar mal, aleha hashlem kol korbanot kulam. When it says about the Korban Tamid, it says on it you should bring the fats. The fats are the parts that we call the imuim that you burn on the altar of all the other sacrifices. After the Korban Tamid, you're supposed to then burn all the fats of all the sacrifices of the day, right? Those were the last things you did, okay? But they're not the real sacrifice. The real sacrifice is done when you sprinkle the blood. After that, they burn the fats and stuff on the altar. But it says, after that, Aleha Hashlem Kola Korbanot Kulam. We're going to see this drasha at the end of the daf today, okay? Meaning, the way they understand Chalbei Hashlamim is finish all your work before you finish the Korban Tamid. And the only thing left is to burn the fats on the altar, but that's the side part. But all the other sacrifices, every other part of the sacrifice, the slaughtering, the burning, all that has to be done before. So basically, since the Korban Tamid has to be the last thing, yes, theoretically, you could do it from 6.5 hours into the day. But like I said, we have to balance everything. We have other voluntary offerings that might come in. If we slaughter at 6.5 and then other things come in, we're going to be stuck. So push it off a little bit. And it's, on the one hand, this is what we're going to see today. You have what we call Zrizim Makdim, and they don't really mention that per se in the Gemara, but it's clear, and Rashi even talks about it, that from Zrizim, you would think, right, we always want to do things first. So you want to do it early. On the other hand, you have to worry and make sure everything is done before that. So therefore, we push off till 8.5 hours on a regular day so that we have room for all the Nidarim and Nidavot. Okay, so we now had two explanations. Why we do it at 8.5? Either according to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, that's the ideal time. According to Rava, it's not the ideal time if we lived in a vacuum, if that were the only thing. But we can't do that because we have to leave time for all the other sacrifices to get done, and therefore we push it off to 8.5 hours. I see Medina, you're questioning, what if we push it off, isn't it a problem? But no, it has a set time in the schedule. This is all about the scheduling. First of all, we weren't so worried in the temple that people were going to forget things because it's very clear that people aren't going to forget things in the temple. People are very careful about things. And if it has a set time, it has a set time. I'm thinking of my son in the army, right? There's a luz, what we call in Hebrew, a luz, which is, the schedule, what you do every hour of the day. It's incredibly scheduled. And that's what it was in the temple. This is what you do every hour. So it's very clear, not much room for problems. Okay, next. So now we're going to say, so therefore, let's read his whole explanation now. Therefore, machrina le tarteshai, so you push it off 2 hours, va'avdina le b'shmona v'mechza, and you do it 8.5 hours into the day. But now we're going to go through, so why in our mission do we change it? Now, according to Rava, it's much more flexible. Ba'arvei Pesachim di'ika Pesach achav and Erev Pesach, when you have the Pesach to deal with after, so then kadmina le sha'achat. In other words, again, it's a balancing game. Since theoretically you could do it from 6.5, normally we push it off because we have all these other sacrifices. On the other end, today we have a sacrifice that has to be done after, so we're going to have to make it earlier. Then, avdina lebeshav v'mechza chal erev Pesach liot erev Shabbat tikanami tzliato delo dache Shabbat mukmina la dina b'shesh v'mechza. And when erev Pesach falls on Friday, where then we have to worry on Friday that we're going to end up, we have to roast it, then we're going to make it even an hour earlier. Someone just asked, where does Mincha Gedola come from exactly from here? This is it. Because Mincha Gedola is 6.5 hours into the day, right? Half an hour after midday, because the assumption is until half an hour after midday, the sun is kind of still in the center of the sky. Once it moves over half an hour, it's already able to be, right? It's already afternoon. That's afternoon. So that's Mincha Gedola, and that's where theoretically you could bring the Korban Tamid, even though they didn't necessarily. Okay, they only did it on Erev Pesach that fell out on a Friday. Now, Tana Rabbanit. Now we're going to get, that was not super complicated, but now we're going to get into the complicated part of today's daf. What happens now? We're going to have a braita. Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva have a debate, but there's a lot of things missing in this debate. We don't really know what exactly is going on here. Okay? Kis siduro b'chol, kach siduro b'shabbat. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Akiva omer kis siduro be'erev Pesach. What's missing here, first of all, is the subject. He says, the same way you do it on Chol, that's how you do it on Shabbat. If I were saying this in English, I would say more like this, and that's how I did it in the chart. The way, when on Shabbat, you do it the same way you do it on a weekday, okay? It's more like the second part is, right, the subject is the second part, which is, how do you do it on Shabbat? Oh, you do it the same day as a weekday. And Rabbi Akiva says, Kasiduro be'erev Pesach. You do it on the same way you do it on Erev Pesach. Meaning he's still talking about the same subject of Shabbat. You do Shabbat like you do Erev Pesach. Now, the Gemara first assumes we're going to have 3 different interpretations. Is this talking about the way you do it on Shabbat, meaning our topic, Shabbat, when Erev Pesach falls on Shabbat? Remember our Mishnah said, Bein b'chol, bein b'Shabbat. It's the same whether Erev Pesach falls on Shabbat or Erev Pesach falls on a regular day. You're going to do the sacrifice at the same time, which is always going to be what? 7.5 hours. Or are they talking about something entirely different? Okay, are they talking about Shabbat on a regular week? Okay, maybe they're not talking about Shabbat on Erev Pesach Shabbat, but regular days. So we're going to see. It's very unclear what they say, so don't worry if you didn't understand a word, because really nobody understood this, and we're going to have 3 different interpretations how to understand this. Maika Amar, when the Gemara says that, it's clear they didn't understand either. Maika Amar means, what are they talking about? Right? What does this mean? Amar Abai, first explanation, Hachi Kamar. Each one's going to explain what Rabbi Yishmael says, what Rabbi Akiva says. They're each going to have to then read it into our Mishnah and say, when our Mishnah said on Erev Pesach, it doesn't matter if it falls on Shabbat or a weekday, it's all going to be the same. And yet Friday is different, right? Remember, Friday 6.5, Shabbat or weekday, right? Erev Pesach is 7.5 and regular day is 8.5. So we're going to have to figure out who our Mishnah matches according to each interpretation. And we're also going to have to figure out what's the root of the debate between them. So that's why I charted all of that out. And then we're going to have on the first 2 explanations, each time someone's going to question. And then because that person questioned, they come up with their own explanation because they didn't like the previous one. So Amar Abai, Hachi Kamar, Kasiduro b'chol be'erev HaPesach, kach siduro b'Shabbat be'erev HaPesach. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. He says that the topic is Shabbat on Erev Pesach, when Erev Pesach falls on Shabbat, like this year. And he says, you do Shabbat and Erev Pesach the same way, the timing, again, of what's the subject? The Tamid sacrifice, daily sacrifice. The timing of that is the same, whether Erev Pesach falls on Shabbat whether it falls on a chol, meaning it's always going to be 7.5 hours. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. Okay, other than, right, he's not talking about Friday. So that matches our Mishnah, right? That's what we said. Bein bechol, bein b'Shabbat. Chol and Shabbat come out the same. That's our Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva Omer, kisiduro be'erev haPesach shechal liot be'erev Shabbat. He says, no, we do on Shabbat like we do on a Friday. Remember, on Friday, we make it an hour earlier at 6.5. Also, when Erev Pesach falls on Shabbat, we do it at 6.5 hours. Okay, now, so again, first thing to figure out is who does the Mishnah hold like? The Mishnah is clearly not Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva thinks that 6.5 hours would be Friday and Shabbat, where Erev Pesach falls on Friday or Shabbat. Whereas our Mishnah said only Friday it's going to be 6.5 and Shabbat's going to be just like Chol, which is what Rabbi Yishmael said according to Abaye. So, Matnitin dekatani bein b'chol bein b'Shabbat, Rabbi Yishmael. Now, what's the root of their debate? B'musafim kodmin lebizichim kamiflage. We're going to add in something totally new right now, which is on Shabbat, another thing happened. Okay, again, this is logistics. There's another thing that has to happen on Shabbat that only happens on Shabbat. What is it? So remember, there's two differences about Shabbat. One is there's no nidarim and nidavot, which theoretically would mean we can make it as early as possible. If you go back to what we said, zrizim makdimin, do it the earliest possible time. On a weekday, you have to worry that there's all these other sacrifices we have to get in. On Shabbat, there is no other sacrifice. There's the musaf. That's the only one. After you're done with the musaf, you can theoretically do the korban pesach, the korban tamid. So now they say, well, there's one other thing you're forgetting about. What is that? Bizichim. Bizichim were these little bowls that they had. There was the lechem apanim, the shulchan in the heichal, in the sanctuary. There was a table. On that table, there were 12 loaves of bread. They were really matzah breads. They weren't really, leavened breads. They sat on that table all week long. Every Shabbat, they would switch them. And on that table sat these two bizichim full of frankincense. And when they took off the old bread, they would take off these bowls with frankincense and they would burn them on the altar. So that's an additional thing you had to do on Shabbat. Now the question is, can you do them before Musaf or after Musaf? Which comes first? So that's the root of their debate. Now, the one assumption you have to assume here, which is very interesting, and then you can start questioning why we daven Musaf early in the morning, but I'll leave that question aside. But Musaf, according to this Gemara, the Musaf sacrifice was done exactly at midday. And that comes from a verse that says Yom b'yomo, daily, even though it wasn't daily, it meant more on the holidays. The end of that verse says, and Yom b'yomo. So they learned from there it was talking about all the holidays, and on holidays you bring korban musaf. Yom b'yomo means you do it at the center of the day. Mamash, what they call bi'itzumo shel yom. When's that? Midday. So the korban musaf, everyone agrees, has to be done midday, 6 hours into the day. So now, if you say the bizichim have to be done after the musaf, then you're going to see why you can't do Shabbat at 6.5 hours. Musafim could mean the bizichim kamiflage. So Rabbi Yishmael Saval, remember, he says, if you want to make it earlier, you can only make it earlier on Shabbat to 7.5 hours, because he holds musafim could mean the bizichim. The musafim come before the bizichim, which means what? Aviluhu musafim b'shesh. So the musaf goes at 6 hours. Bizichim b'sheva. Then you deal with the frankincense and you burn that 7 hours, because remember, the sacrifices take about an hour. The avidle, now the frankincense is going to take less. You don't have to slaughter an animal. You don't, right? All you have to do is burn it on the altar. So avidle l'tamid b'sheva b'mechze. So the korban tamid would then be at 7.5 hours. That's Rabbi Yishmael. That's how he gets to 7.5, even on Shabbat. Meaning, even though you don't have to push off the tamid for the nidarim and nidavot, the voluntary offerings, because there are none, you have to push it off because of the bezichin. Something else fits in there. Rabbi Akiva savar bezichin kodmin lemusafim. So bezichin b'chamesh, musafim b'shesh, v'avid le'tamid b'shesh v'mechze. Interesting, by the way, here, I didn't see anyone deal with this. I didn't actually look. I just occurred to me a few minutes ago as I was teaching that, wait, there was something that didn't fit in, which is in this case, he counts the musaf as only half an hour. He assumes the musaf sacrifice is only going to take a half an hour, and therefore half an hour later at 6:30 or at 6.5 hours into the day already at 12:30, you can do the korban tamid. Okay, so basically that's explaining what their machloket is. Rabbi Akiva thinks the bizichin can go earlier in the morning, and Rabbi Yishmael thinks not, and that's why Rabbi Yishmael has it on Shabbat. Pesach, that falls on Shabbat, we make it earlier, but only an hour earlier, not to all the way to 6.5. And according to Rabbi Akiva, we can make it 6.5 because we have nothing else pushing us. Nothing at all. Okay. Matkif la Rav. Rav doesn't like his interpretation. He says it doesn't fit with the words. Midi Rabbi Akiva kasiduro be'erev Pesach shechal liot be'erev Shabbat katane. Remember what Rabbi Akiva said? Rabbi Akiva said, Shabbat, erev Pesach falls on Shabbat. We do like when it falls on sorry, I didn't say it right. Erev Pesach that falls on Shabbat, we treat it like an Erev Pesach that falls on Friday. But listen to the words. He said, Kesiduro be'erev Pesach. He didn't say it's like Erev Pesach that when it falls on Friday. It doesn't say those words. So where did you come up with that? So therefore, Rava doesn't like his interpretation, right? Midi Rabbi Akiva Kesiduro be'erev Pesach shchali be'erev Shabbat kadani. It doesn't say Erev Pesach that was on Erev Shabbat. He doesn't have Erev Shabbat anywhere there. Kesiduro be'erev Pesach stama katani. It just said we're going to treat Shabbat like Erev Pesach, which sounds like what Abaye said, Rabbi Yishmael was saying, Bein b'chol, bein b'Shabbat, like our Mishnah. And that's in fact how Rava is going to explain Rabbi Akiva in this interpretation. He's going to say that Rabbi Akiva is the one who holds Chol and Shabbat are the same, and he's going to understand Rabbi Yishmael differently. Ela amar Rava hachi kamar. This is how to read it, and he starts off with Rabbi Yishmael. Now remember what Rabbi Yishmael said. Look at the words. If you have the chart, you can see it. I'll pull it up for a minute. Sorry, no, I have to pull it up. No, it's not open. 1 second. Okay, let's do that again. Okay, here we go. Okay, here's our chart. So here's the words of the Braita. Kisiduro b'chol, kach siduro b'Shabbat. So how is he going to explain that? So let's read inside. Right, which basically means the way we do it on Shabbat is the way we do it on a weekday. But he's not going to say it the way we said it before. Kisiduro b'chol da'alma. The way we do it on a regular weekday during the year, not when Erev Pesach falls on a weekday. Remember I said this is missing words. Are we talking about Pesach? Are we talking about a regular day? The way we do it on a regular day during the year, kach sidro b'Shabbat be'erev haPesach. On a regular Shabbat, on a Shabbat, when Erev Pesach falls on Shabbat, we do it like a regular day, meaning 8.5 hours. Okay, we're down here now. We do it at exactly 8.5 hours. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. Okay, we're going to have to see why on earth would they push it off on Shabbat. Hold off on that. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Kisidro be'erev haPesach. Right, Rabbi Akiva says, no, the way we do it on Erev Pesach, Kisidro be'erev haPesach. No, we don't do it the way we do it on a regular day. We do it the way it's always done on Erev Pesach. So when Erev Pesach falls on Shabbat, it's just like, this is our Mishnah. Bein b'chol, bein b'Shabbat. It's all the same, whether it's a weekday, whether it's Shabbat, 7.5 hours. So now, what's the debate between them? So first, before we get to the debate, we have to say, so who does our Mishnah hold like? So our Mishnah that said bein b'chol, bein b'Shabbat is Rabbi Akiva. Umanitin dekatani bein b'chol, bein b'Shabbat, Rabbi Akiva. B'mai kamiflage, what's the root of their machloket? Very interesting machloket. This is again logistics entirely. B'michmar bisra kamiflage. Are we worried about the meat rotting? What's the difference about Shabbat? We didn't discuss this before. On Friday, what did we say? You have to roast the whole thing before Shabbat comes in. On Shabbat, you can't roast the meat at all on Shabbat, right? Normally, on a regular day, you don't have to get it all into the day. But if you see the meat starting to go bad, you can start cooking it and it won't rot. No refrigeration in those days. So he says, we're worried about the meat rotting. So therefore, and therefore, push it off as late as possible. How late can you do it? Well, let's take as late as you do on a regular day. If on every day you could do it at 8.5 hours, so then today let's do the tamid 8.5. That will push off the Korban Pesach till later in the afternoon. And then you do the Korban Pesach closer to the end of the day, less likely it's going to rot. He says, I'm not worried about that happening. Okay, why not? I don't know, but he's not worried about it. Okay, maybe he thinks not enough time to elapse, even if we do it earlier. And therefore, right, he says the more important thing is reason makdim. Let's do it earlier. We have no reason to do it later. So Shabbat will be at 7.5. So I see, Gita, you're writing it's not that hot on Pesach. That's because you live in America. But in Israel, I once was on a tiyul with my kids on Erev Pesach and on Pesach itself. And it was like one of those brutally, brutally hot days. It definitely happens that there's heat waves in Israel. Okay. So anyway, now they say, well, wait a minute. Ilo chashinan, if you're not worried about Michmar Bisra, Rabbi Akiva, ne'avde b'shesh v'mechzeh. So do it the earliest possible time. Why do you have it at 7.5? Do it at 6.5, like we do on Erev Shabbat. So now you might answer, what I would have answered is, well, he's not worried it's going to rot if you keep it at 7.5 and then the Korban Pesach is at 8.5. But if you do it so early, then maybe it will rot. But the Gemara doesn't answer that. They say, oh, it must be, and this is going to come out the reverse of what Abaye said, which is kasavar musafin kodmin lebizichin. There's another consideration. Remember, it's just a fun game of, what are all the factors? So he's not worried about meat rotting. Therefore, let's do it as early as possible. We can't do it as early as possible because the bezichin can only come after the musaf. So if we do the bezichin after the musaf, again, we're back to avale musafin b'shesh. Musaf happens at 6 hours, right? Meaning midday. Bezichin b'sheva, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, you do the bezichin. V'avile l'tami b'sheva v'mechza, and then the tummy comes out at 7.5. So basically, we're going to end up saying, right, we have two debates here. We have Abaye who says that Rabbi Yishmael holds Shabbat, we do it at 7.5, and Rabbi Akiva holds 6.5. According to Rava, no. Rabbi Yishmael is saying you do it like a regular day on Shabbat, 8.5 hours, because we're worried about the meat rotting. We want to do it as late as possible because you can't roast the meat till nighttime. Rabbi Akiva says 7.5. Okay, so now, and then our Mishnah matches Rabbi Akiva according to Rava, and it matches Rabbi Yishmael according to Abaye. Here we're going to come up with a problem with Rava, though. It's funny that Rava said, Abaye, what you said didn't fit in with the words of the Braita. It's exactly what Rabbi Bar Ula is going to say to Rava. And Gita, that's what I said before, that Rava switches the order. Exactly. You see how they play with different, nobody really knows what Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael held about whether the bezichin come first or the musafim. So in the first case, in order to explain their opinions, we said, according to Rabbi Yishmael, the musaf comes first, the bezichin after. And Rabbi Akiva, it was the reverse. But this time we reverse it to make it make sense, okay? Because nobody really knows what they held about that. Ela Amar Rabba Bar Ula. I missed his question. Matkifla Rabba Bar Ula. Midi kisidro bechol kach sidro be'erev b'Shabbat be'erev haPesach. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael Katani. He says, right, Rabba had questioned Rabbi Akiva's wording according to Abaye. He's questioning Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael doesn't say anywhere kach sidro b'Shabbat be'erev haPesach. Right? Notice the words. Rabbi Yishmael says, Kis siduro bechol, kach siduro b'Shabbat. He never mentions Erev Pesach. This is what we said before, right? The words Erev Pesach were never mentioned there. So therefore, kach siduro b'Shabbat stama katane. Sounds like he's just talking about a regular Shabbat, not even about Pesach, right? We assumed it was Erev Pesach because that's what we're talking about. But they brought in this Braita from who knows where. Wasn't even talking about it. Only Rabbi Akiva says kis siduro b'Erev Pesach. But no one else was talking about Erev Pesach before that, and as Rabbi Yishmael wasn't. So therefore, Ela Amar Rabba Bar Ula, he has a whole unique interpretation. Hachi katani, ki sidro b'chol da'alma, kach sidro b'Shabbat da'alma. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael wasn't talking about Pesach at all. He says, what time do we do the Korban Tamid on a regular Shabbat during the year? The same time we do it on a regular day, 8.5 hours. Okay. Rabbi Akiva Omer, ki sidro be'erev haPesach da'alma. He says, the same way on Erev Pesach, we move everything an hour earlier. That's what you do on every Shabbat. Every Shabbat, you move the Korban Tamid an hour earlier. Now, according to this, they're not arguing about what you do on Pesach. It sounds like everybody agrees what happens on Pesach. And it sounds very clear that everyone thinks, what do you do on Pesach? 7.5 hours. It's just a matter, is a regular Shabbat like Erev Pesach or not? So therefore, now we go back to our Mishnah. When our Mishnah said on Pesach, on Erev Pesach, right, umanitin dekatane bein bechol bein b'Shabbat, it doesn't matter, weekday Shabbat, that's divrei kolhi. You can now explain, now we don't really know what they say, but we can assume that since Rabbi Yishmael isn't having anything to do with Pesach, he's just talking about Shabbat versus Chol on a regular week. And Rabbi Akiva comes and says, no, we do it just like we do on Erev Pesach. It sounds like they agree what you do on Erev Pesach, and it sounds like there's no distinctions Erev Pesach. Erev Pesach must be one din, right? Only unique exception would have to be Friday. He doesn't think that Friday's the same. That's because you have some other consideration. But Shabbat and Erev Shabbat, Shabbat and weekday would be the same. And then our Mishnah can match all the opinions. What's their machloket then? Why do they have a machloket about what you do on a regular Shabbat? Is a regular Shabbat like a regular day, or is it different? This is all bigzerat nidarim nidavot unidarim kamiflage. Their machloket is, now remember, we said there's no voluntary offerings. Nidarim and nidavot are voluntary offerings. There's no voluntary offerings on Shabbat. If there's no voluntary offerings on Shabbat, theoretically, we can make it earlier. However, if we make it earlier on Shabbat, what are we worried? Maybe people will get in their minds that we can do the Korban Tamid earlier, and they'll start doing it earlier on a weekday. You can think, by the way, this is about this zealous, attitude in the temple, and people will say, oh, let's do it early. But it's actually sometimes being overly zealous creates problems, because then we're not going to be able, right? We'll be stuck with all these nidarim and nidavot that people brought and maybe slaughtered, and now we don't have time to sacrifice them. They'll be disqualified. So because of that, we don't want to create this situation. So therefore, maybe we should treat Shabbat the same way as a regular day, even though theoretically we could do it earlier. But again, logistical concern that people will get confused on a regular day. So he says, this is their machloket. So again, Rabbi Yishmael, who holds Shabbat and Chol are the same on a regular week. Gazlin on Shabbat atu Chol. He says we want to make a gzera on Shabbat so that you don't confuse on a weekday and think that you could do it earlier. For Rabbi Akiva savar lo gazlin. Rabbi Akiva says there's no reason to make a gzera here, which, by the way, one can answer very easily. Why not? Because in the temple, people were very careful about laws. Gzerot are usually for the average person, but in the temple, now again, we had yesterday that not everything was hunky-dory in the temple, and there were a lot of problems. But theoretically, one could say that the Kohanim knew what to do, and therefore there is a good reason why I see Shoshana, you're writing exactly that, which is that's maybe why Rabbi Akiva said there's no reason to make a gzera. We've seen it many times that the Kohanim are considered zrizim. So now, that's their machloket, okay? Rabbi Shmuel savar gazrina, and Rabbi Akiva savar lo gazrina. So now we have again a question on Rabbi Akiva. Why? Well, if there's no gzera, lo gazrina, navde b'shesh v'mechza. Why don't we do it as early as 6.5 hours? Why do we push it off to 7.5 on Erev Pesach? Kasavar, again, we say the same thing we said according to Rava, which was the opposite of what Abaye said. He must hold musafin kodmin lebizichin. The musaf comes first. You can only do the bizichin after you do the musaf. Musafin b'shesh, ubizichim b'sheva, va'avet le'tamid b'sheva v'mechza. So as we keep seeing, right, then the musaf is at 6, the bizichin are at 7, right, meaning 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and then half an hour later, you can already do the regular korban tamid. Okay, now, that's their opinions, okay? Now it's really important to look at the next chart on the sheet, and I'm going to share my screen and help you with it. And if you're listening without the screen, then, try to print it or open it and see. This chart is very important. I charted out Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva according to the 3 opinions. This helps you visualize. On a regular day, it helps you visualize what they argue about and what they disagree about. Everyone agrees that on a regular day, it's 8.5 hours. Everyone agrees that. Everyone agrees that Erev Pesach that falls on a regular day is at 7.5 hours. Everyone agrees about Pesach on a regular day. And everyone agrees that Erev Pesach on Friday will be an hour earlier, 6.5 hours. So the debate between them is, number one, Rabba Bar Ula, who adds in this thing about a regular Shabbat, which no one else discusses, so we don't really know what they think about this. On a regular Shabbat, according to Rabba Bar Ula, Rabbi Yishmael thinks 8.5, and Rabbi Akiva thinks 7.5. And according to, right, because remember the gzera, do we make a gzera on the Nidarim and Nidavot or not to confuse people on the Yom Chol? And Rava and Abaye debate, okay, and here what's highlighted are the things where what matches our Mishnah, Bein B'chol, Bein B'Shabbat, right? Are they the same? So I highlighted wherever the 7.5 hours appears, right, according to Abaye, it's Rabbi Yishmael. According to Rava, it's Rabbi Akiva, and according to Rabbi Ula, it's all of them, right? So then we have these debates about what they hold on Erev Pesach b'Yom Shabbat. So now we're going to bring a question on Rava from the following source, Meitive. Tamid kol hashana kula karev kilchata. The korban tamid all year long is done kilchata, meaning according to its laws. What are its laws? Nishchat b'shmona v'mechza, b'karev b'tesha v'mechza. Okay, this everyone agrees about. Yom Regil, 8.5 hours. Ube'erev haPesach nishchat b'sheva v'mechza, b'karev b'shmona v'mechza. That also everyone agrees about. So far, so good. But here comes the problem for Rava. Chal liyot b'Shabbat. Okay, so look at you. This is why the chart is very helpful, and the one in the Koran also very much helps you. Rava says Erev Pesach chal liyot b'Shabbat, according to Rabbi Yishmael. We're starting with Rabbi Yishmael. Would be at 8.5 hours. Okay, so now let's see what Rabbi Yishmael says here. Chal liyot b'Shabbat, kechal liyot b'sheni b'Shabbat. If Erev Pesach falls on Shabbat, we're going to treat it the same way as if Erev Pesach would fall on a Monday. Okay. Some people say, particularly they chose Monday for a reason. I'm not going to get into it, but let's just assume he just means any random day during the week, which means it would be, right, 7.5. It would be like any Erev Pesach that falls on a regular day. And he says 8.5. So that doesn't match. So that's Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva Omer, again, Rabbi Akiva's words are very unclear, so you could kind of probably explain them any way you want. Kisidro be'erev haPesach. Okay, it's like Erev haPesach, which doesn't really make what exactly it means. It's not clear, but anyway, let's leave that aside right now. So Bishlam ala Abaye nicha. According to Abaye, this matches perfectly because that's exactly what Abaye said. According to Rabbi Yishmael, when Erev Pesach falls on Yom Shabbat, I'm going here at the top part of the chart on Abaye, on Erev Pesach Shechal b'Yom Shabbat, it's going to be 7.5, just like Erev Pesach on a weekday. But Elal Rava Kasha. So now they say, Amar l'cha Rava. Rava can explain very easily. When it says, now, I don't know if you noticed this, but I added a word that didn't appear there. I said it's like Monday when Erev Pesach falls on a Monday. But maybe he meant, now notice, what does Rabbi Yishmael say according to Rava? 8.5. Maybe it means it's like any Monday, a Yom Ragil, during a regular, not on Erev Pesach. So that's what he says. Lo tema kechal b'sheni b'Shabbat, ela ema k'sheni b'Shabbat de'alma. Don't say it's like when Erev Pesach falls on a Monday. No, it's like a regular Monday during the year, not Erev Pesach. And then that matches perfectly. So Rava answered the question. Next question on Abaye, Meitivi. Chal liot b'Shabbat, kesidro kol hashana kula, divrei Rabbi Yishmael. When it falls on Shabbat, right, meaning Erev Pesach falls on Shabbat, so let's go, right, Rabbi Yishmael falls on Shabbat, kesidro kol hashana kula, okay, which sounds like 8.5, right? Or maybe it could be, maybe it's 7.5, not so clear. Rabbi Akiva Omer, kesidro be'erev Pesach de'alma. Okay, it sounds like, right, sorry, it is clear what he's saying, sorry. Chal liot b'Shabbat, kesidro kol hashana kula would be 8.5, right? That's Rava, right? It's like any day of the year. And Rabbi Akiva says, no, it's like it is on a regular Erev Pesach, which would be 7.5. So that, right, that's, notice what Rabbi Akiva says. He says 6.5. He doesn't say 7.5. So neither of these opinions match. So Bishlam ala Rava, Elal Abaye Kashya. So Amar l'cha Abaye, Abaye can explain, Lo tema kisidro kol hashana, ela ema kisidro kol hashanim kulan, divrei Rabbi Yishmael. You don't have to say, when Rabbi Yishmael said on Erev Pesach Shechal liot b'Shabbat, right, it falls on Shabbat, you do it like you do on a regular day during the year. No, what he meant was you do it like you do every single Erev Pesach, meaning last year it was on a Monday and the year before it was on a different day, right? That's what he meant, okay? And then in which case it would be 7.5, and that would match perfectly with Rabbi Yishmael according to Abaye, as you see here, 7.5, 7.5. And then Rabbi Akiva Omer, Kisidro, now what did Rabbi Akiva say according to him? Kisidro be'erev haPesach de'alma. Now that sounded like every Erev Pesach. So what did he mean? If Rabbi Yishmael meant that, he has to mean something else. Kisidro erev Pesach shechal liot be'erev Shabbat. He adds, just like he did last time, Abaye reads it as when it falls on Erev Shabbat, which is 6.5 hours. Okay, so we basically explained the contradictions here. Each one can explain each one according to the way he reads it. Again, all of these Brightot are classic examples where the wording wasn't very clear and we needed to, right? Those who went to the skills class last week, you can connect it. It's the same idea. We had a Mishnah, and the Mishnah could be interpreted in many, many different ways. And this often happens with Tannaitic sources. And that's why, right, they're particularly unclear. We end up with many different interpretations. Okay, last part for today. This is much more simple. Tanu Rabbanan, minayin shelo yehei davar kodem l'tamid shel shachar. Okay, the Brighta is going to say, how do we know nothing can be before the Korban Tamid and nothing can be after it? So first they're starting with nothing can be before. Talmud lomar va'arach aleha ha'olah, and you put on the olah, and that's about the Korban Tamid, the daily sacrifice. So they stop the Brighta to say, I don't get how you learned from that verse. My Talmuda, how did you learn it from that pasuk? Amarava ha'olah olah rishona. It says arach aleha ha'olah. It says it with a hea yidiyah, which means the olah. That means this is the first. Now the Brighta continues. How do you know nothing comes after it? We saw this earlier, but now we're going to see two options here. My Talmuda, how do you get it from that pasuk? Right? It means you burn on it the fats of the peace offerings. So Amar Abaye, aleh hashlamim v'lo al chaver tashlamim. It means this is the last thing, right? That you burn then the fats of the shlamim, but you don't burn anything after this, right? And you don't You don't bring a korban shlamim after. You only bring the chaylev, right? The fats of it, but not an actual korban. So Matkif LaRava, Rava says that's not a good explanation. Abai, ema shlamim udelo nakriv, ha'olot nakriv. It sounds like, well, shlamim, we already talked about this yesterday. Shlamim are kochim kalim. They're less significant because the owners get to eat the meat, whereas the ola is entirely burnt to God. It's the highest level of sacrifice. So maybe it means you can't bring a shlamim after, but maybe you could bring a different ola after. Let's say I bring a voluntary offering to the temple. That's an ola where I'm going to burn the whole thing on the altar. Maybe I could bring that after. So he has a different explanation. Hashlamim, and this is what we saw before. Aleha hashlem kol korbanot kulam. The word shlamim means peace offering, but it also means hashlem, to complete. Complete everything before you finish this. Okay? So just to review very briefly, our main topic here was the korban tamid, but it was when do we do the korban tamid and change the timing of it based on, right, when we have to also do the korban pesach and when we have other considerations at play, and how do we basically organize this calendar, right, the scheduling in the temple on unique days and even on regular days. Okay, so we'll end here for today. And I said, okay, so I see, Shana, you're asking, isn't the Pesach Hashlamim? So again, we're going to have to see why. What we're left with is, if we made this whole big deal that nothing can come after the Korban Ola, how do we do the Pesach after the Korban Ola? So we'll leave that open for now. Have a great day, everyone.